We are live, and welcome to episode 19. It's on embracing imperfection, navigating the pitfalls of perfectionism. We have with us today Brian Shapiro of Shapiro Communication, which is an organization focused on organizational communication training, and he's the founder there, and he is also an instructor at both the Wharton School and the Organizational Dynamics group at UPenn. I think I just said one of those wrong, but that's a great way to kick off perfectionism. Brian, what is on your mind?
Like what we're going to do for dinner tonight. We got one of my kids' friends is coming over, and he's a vegetarian. And so just trying to figure out how we make sure we keep all that good. Yeah, we're going to be perfect with how we feed our guests.
I got it.
So, Brian, can you tell us a little bit about, you and I talked a little while back, but tell us about, you are doing some pretty cool stuff on helping people sort of overcome, or not overcome, but sort of embrace their sort of the imperfections and so forth, and that's where the title came from. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the program that you're doing with folks. It's a cool program. So
yeah, well, perfectionism, as most people know, we probably all suffer from it in one way or another, right? It's this idea that we always have to be perfect under all circumstances, and it seems like the pressure on being perfect just continues to go up and up and up. I like to refer to myself as a recovering perfectionist. I've probably had to deal with it probably more of my life than I was aware of until I really started to delve into this topic. And the reason I got into perfectionism was I work with undergraduates at the Wharton School. It's primarily sophomores who have to take a specific type of business communication class, and I'm part of a team that teaches. And I was coming to be disturbed by how much students would get upset, not just upset, oh, I didn't get the A, I got the A minus, but how much they took that as a personal reflection of themselves and their value and their worth. And it really came to a critical juncture for me when I had one student who was an international student who was a double major, who was taking 7 units, which is a really high course load, wound up getting an A minus in the course that I teach, which is a fairly difficult course. It's not a simple, it's a skill building course. And to summarize, the email that I got was something to the effect of, well, I'm sorry, my value wasn't reflected in the grade that I earned in the class, right? Or something to that degree. And it bothered me because, one, I know that we're dealing with high incidence of mental illness, suicidal ideation, suicide, other really debilitative out of sort of young adults today. And the fact that this one young person could not recognize the accomplishment of
an A
minus in at an Ivy League school while double majoring and taking excessive course load, I could no longer just idly sit by and do nothing about it. And so I happened at the same time to have reconnected with a musician friend here in Philadelphia. And we started sort of talking. He was doing a lot of creativity coaching and really help guiding people through the creative process and all the uncertainty and anxiety that comes along with that. And I was sharing some of the experience that I was having at Penn with some of the students and looking back at some of the work that I've done with organizations. And we kind of got together and created this course using sort of the creative process as a way to help people find ways to navigate through their own debilitative problem. That's what leads me to you here today.
So I have a question about, so completely understand the school level thing. And I actually see it already with my high school age and middle school age kids. where my son was talking to me the other day about like 4.3 GPAs, and I was like, what is a 4.3 GPA? I've never heard of such a thing, right? But how does this translate into the business world, right? Like, how do you see this playing out when we're talking about a corporate environment as opposed to an academic environment?
I mean, that's a really good question. And what I'm discovering through the research and reading that I've done is that, there's a lot of talk about innovation and risk, right? And it's sort of celebrated terminology. However, at the same time, organizations and individuals with organizations are really afraid to take risks and really afraid to truly be innovative, because the sense is that if this doesn't work out as desired, then something is wrong with me. And all the negative emotions that come along with that, and one of the biggest ones of that being shame, come into play. So as a result, whatever ideas people might have that might fall outside of what is the current mode of thinking in an organization are getting self-suffocated, because an individual doesn't want to place themselves in a position where they might actually be wrong about something. And organizations, not because they're bad and not because they're intending to, but they may be fostering an environment that is actually choking off the oxygen that is needed in order for these new ideas to be able to move forward. And, a lot of that probably has to do with the times we're living in and the culture that we're living in, right? And Thomas Curran, who's at the London School of Economics, he wrote a wonderful book called The Perfection Trap. And in this book, he looks at what's called, socially oriented perfectionism. And there are three different types of perfectionism he addresses, but socially oriented perfectionism is I have to be seen as perfect in other people's eyes. And if I'm not seen as perfect, then something's wrong with me. And you could see how that might work within an organizational structure, right? If an organization is trying to always present itself as being the organization that has the answers, the organization that always does things right, it's more concerned about how it's being perceived than it may be of the actual execution of what it is they're trying to do. And that could be filtering through the organizational structure and causing people to be so self-conscious about what they say and how they present that it's actually inhibiting the flow of ideas, which may be sort of undercutting the organization's ability to fulfill its mission. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to your question.
So I'd like to build on that and just kind of bring up the concept that sometimes organizations talk about, which is fail fast, fail cheap, which is, to me, I guess, some form of an excuse or acceptance of imperfection, right? But the interesting conundrum there is that organizations talk about it, but not all of them actually walk that talk. So how could a leader in an organization help the culture and help the organization walk that talk, in your thought, in your opinion?
I mean, I think like anytime you're dealing with trying to activate change amongst a group of people, and particularly with adults, I mean, I think it's the best thing to do is to model that yourself. So I think what a leader needs to be able to do is to be able to demonstrate and reveal their own imperfection in what they're doing. So maybe there's an initiative or an idea that they bring forward that they actually aren't certain is going to work out. They're not, there's no guaranteed outcome, and they're going to put it out there anyways for the sake of putting it out there, just to see what may happen, knowing full well that it might fail. And when it does fail and it doesn't work out as planned, that they embrace that and celebrate that anyways, because it was just part of the discovery process that they needed to go through. So I think there needs to be a modeling of that. And I think that's the first step towards doing so. I think another thing that leaders for organizations can do is to help create a culture that tolerates imperfection, right? And actively encourages imperfection. I think there's some examples. So I'm reading a book currently called The Imperfectionist that Robert McLean and Charles Kahn have put out. And they're both with McKinsey. And they talk about creating a culture of imperfection within organizations. And can organizations take a certain percentage of time and dedicate that to, let's just try things. And irregardless of what the outcome may be, it's all about process, and it's all about being curious, and it's all about discovery. And we're not going to judge ourselves, and we're not going to judge our people, but we're going to see what comes out of this and kind of trying to build that into the culture. But I think it all comes back to, how do we model it, right? How do we model it as leaders for the people we're asking to follow us?
So Brian, it's interesting that as you're talking about that, so I'm a book listener, so I'll say listen, even though, I often say read, but it's not really true. I listened to this book recently called Mastering Leadership, and it was talking about this idea of, as I'm going to take two concepts that I think you've been talking about over the last few minutes. Is the first one is this point about this view that people have about their identity, which is that I am my results. And he was talking about that sort of idea of I am my results, and it's the limitations that it creates. And I think that's a lot of what you're talking about, like this sort of like, if I didn't produce something perfect or whatever. And this leads to, I think, with people who, particularly like when you talk about something like a PhD or these higher degrees, or, gone to these, sort of top schools like Wharton or whatever, these are people who have spent their entire lives achieving, right? And they think about themselves as achieving. And I think there's this really interesting sort of identity flip that could happen, which I think is a little bit what you're talking about, which is you could look at it as you are sort of the sum total of your achievements, or you could take a different look at your identity and say, no, I am not my achievements. I am just really good at learning. And if you can change your mindset to, I am a learner, as opposed to I am a set of results that I've gotten, I think it sort of changes the sort of overall, sort of view of how you think about things like getting feedback, or, trying something and taking a risk. It's okay to learn if you are a learner. It is not okay to make a mistake if you are an achiever, right? So anyway, that's your thoughts on that. But
well, it makes me think of the growth mindset, right? And Dweck, and that whole idea of, it's just, can you put yourself in the mode of sort of being that learner and always being that learner? I always sort of wondered, where did we get the idea that at a certain point in life we're done learning, right? So from the time we're born till, all right, I've gotten whatever degree I'm going to get, or I've gotten to wherever I'm going to get with my education, and now I'm done. And now I'm just going to sort of maintain that same worldview all the way through until my dying days. Where did that come from? I don't know. But I think a lot of us can put ourselves in that position. One, it's comfortable, because I think once we get to a place where we feel like we know, then we can settle into it. We can sink into it. We can sort of exhale into it. But there are limitations to doing so. One, it inhibits growth because it doesn't give you an opportunity to continue to develop and become something different than what you might otherwise be.
I think there's a pernicious, you were talking about the different kinds of perfectionism. I think there's a sort of pernicious, attitude, particularly among certain populations of more senior people or whatever. I mean, I've seen this a number of times in my career where like the new person comes in and like humiliating them when they make a mistake, publicly sort of, particularly if there's some other political benefit, because you're actually going after their boss or whatever. But I feel like there's in some, which unfortunately is a lot of organizations where there's this toxic behaviors, I think that there's this external drive that forces people to self-edit, to not ask questions because it might make them look like they don't know what they're talking about, to, just sort of compounds that sort of scholar level perfectionism, and then just makes it like even more difficult to make those mistakes.
I mean, I think that's a really good sort of way of sort of explaining how this can manifest and how it can exist. I mean, I think about, a couple of things. So when I look back to the students that I work with, right, these are all super high achieving, top of their class, right, in order to be able to sort of get admitted into Penn and into Wharton. And it's very interesting that you have to say to them, half of you are going to graduate bottom 50% of the class.
It's like that. What was that? That Lake Wobegon where everybody's above average or whatever.
You're all excellent at statistics and number. You understand that. That's a hard sort of factual reality. Half of you are going to be the bottom of your class. You want to talk about the shattering of sense of self and identity. Right. I mean, it's an existential crisis, right? Because I've never been anything but sort of top of my, right. And it's so interesting for me because I was always one who was like, I don't want to strive. Like I intentionally early on made the, and look, I'm even judging with a stupid choice, right? But I was like, I'm not going to try very hard. It's not worth it. I don't like it. I'm just going to see if I can skate by and do as little as possible and just kind of skate my way through. And until a certain point,
there's a balance. There's another piece of this, though. I think there are certain things that we make metrics out of that because there are metrics like grades, et cetera, we start to overinflate their importance. But I can see, like, for example, like social have you ever, the common perfectionist is not like, and then I wasn't emotionally intelligent enough. That is not usually the thing that people are perfectionist about. They are much more likely to be perfectionists about like deliverables and, how many sales made or what outcome oriented things. And as opposed to being perfectionists against things that I would argue are sometimes even more important, probably often more important, like, how do you interact with other human beings and make them successful?
I mean, yeah, it's where do we choose to sort of make the determination about what is going to sort of be the measuring stick that we're going to use to sort of get our sense of value and worth, right? And that when we talk about how that sort of gets reinforced. So let's talk about institutionally how that can get reinforced. So Elena, the question about like what can leaders do and how can this happen within an organization? So let's just look, for example, within the culture of an organization. I'll just use sort of where I currently am as an example of that, right? These are these sort of high-powered institutions where, it's top, go, go, go. And, there was a certain point in time where we'd have these sort of faculty get-togethers, and the faculty that were being sort of called out were the ones who got the highest teaching evaluations, right? And you got to realize these teaching evaluations students are asked to do it right before they can get their grades, and they're very simple sort of scales, 0 to 4 type of thing. There's really not much to them, right? And these are 19, 20-year-old emotionally charged individuals, right? Are they really in a position to evaluate? But the fact is that was being taken and held up and saying, here's evidence to show that you're a great teacher or you're not a great teacher. Right? And so we were having some conversations about that, and that's since been sort of removed from the equation in terms of talking about teaching, because what it was doing was subtly, and not even subtly, but very directly sort of reinforcing this: if you're not always hitting top, then you're not hitting the mark, right? And these are the ways that organizations and institutions can be unconsciously sort of continuing to reinforce this. You have to hit this mark in order to be recognized as valuable and in order to be recognized as having worth. And I think those are things to be mindful of, right? How might we as leaders be doing that? Not in a mean way, and certainly not necessarily in an intentional way to limit growth and limit new ideas, but are we falling into this trap of it's always got to be measured, quantified, and shown, and then that's what's going to be the thing that determines whether or not you're valuable?
So let me build on that a little bit. So when we talked prior, just a few minutes ago, we talked about imperfection in context of innovation and trying to experiment and fail and organizationally accept that it's okay, right? So that aside, the whole premise of business is accomplish certain goals, is to deliver certain bottom line, triple crown, and all of that. How could you allow yourself not to be measured if the whole reason you show up, so to speak, is to deliver and be measured? Question mark.
All right. Great questions, right? So to what measurement are you sort of applying this what measurement are you using to evaluate success? So if you're a public entity and you have shareholders to be accountable for, there's going to be a different metric than there might be for a private company that isn't worried about having to sort of show continued demonstrated growth over a course of time type of approach. So that's going to be a factor that comes into play. But there can be, my sense is there can be a calibration of how we define what this growth is and how does it need to be, we always need to be showing 4% growth, 5% growth, 10%, right? Does it always need to be that? Because one of the arguments against perfectionism that Tom Curran makes is really these standards oftentimes are impossible standards to meet anyways for ourselves. Organizations can have impossible standards that they're trying to set for themselves. And typically the answer to not meeting impossible standards is to create even more impossible standards to compensate for having not hit those standards, right? And
and usually there's like a Google Doc or something it's associated with those.
Whatever form you want, but you're setting yourself up, right, for failure, right? On a deeply personal level. That's where I think our main concern is with individuals, right? Yeah, we want healthy, functioning organizations, but you need individuals in that organization who are doing well. We just have too many mental health crises that are going on right now, right? And part of what's driving this is this sort of socially oriented perfectionism, which is in many cases driven by sort of a lot of the social media platforms that are out there that allow us to really sculpt and craft an image and put it out there. It isn't necessarily a true, genuine reflection of who that individual is, but it's what we quickly see in a moment at a time when we make our snap judgment evaluations about it. And it again creates this standard of like, how can we live up to this? I think organizations that can make a conscious choice of like, okay, we want to grow, but at what pace do we want to grow? We like to say, how can we have, sustainable innovation, sustainable in the fact that there's like a holistic approach to it that takes into account all the people who are part of this process, and how can you create the type of culture that allows people to become more and more of who they are without the pressure of always having to achieve certain metrics all the time. And it doesn't mean the work shouldn't be good, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't strive for a certain standard, but to ease up on the whole process of it all so that, I think Quincy Jones, the legendary sort of producer and musician himself, I think the quote was something, whenever a band gets ready to go into the studio, something like, I try to tell them, let's leave 30% of the time available for the happy magic and the little accidents that happen that can transform a song from a good song into something that becomes truly remarkable. You don't script that stuff in advance, but it goes back to the old adage, luck befalls the well prepared. So they're always, not being perfect doesn't mean not trying. Not being perfect doesn't mean not doing your due diligence and not being thoughtful about the approach that you're taking. But in some ways, there is a spiritual quality to it, because in that let's let go of what the outcome is going to be. And if you look to, when I was younger, I got very into reading the Bhagavad Gita, one of the Hindu sort of sacred text. And I remember, reading about the epic battle that's going to take place, and Arjuna, and Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna, and Arjuna doesn't want to fight in this battle because it's unjust. It's family against family, and I don't want to do this. And he's being counseled, and he says, the worst thing you can do is actually not do anything. Right? Inaction is the worst thing. But what you need to learn how to do is how to proceed and act without any attachment to what the outcome is going to be. And I think that's what part of the overcoming perfection is perfectionism in some ways is trying to control everything. I want to control, I want to define, I want to control, I want to define. How can we let go of that control so that whatever emerges or needs to emerge has the opportunity to do so, and then we don't judge it. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Easier said than done. And I think that's where, when we do our work with organizations and the individuals within that organization, we're trying to help them find a level of acceptance and tolerance of the ambiguity and anxiety that results from the uncertainty of any outcome of any course of action they may want to take.
So Brian, I'm guessing that you would not be a potential target for the app I just conceived of, where we could bring dislike counts to your work, where you could just do that during meetings or whatever. Anyway, I just wanted to use that as a transition over to Jeff, if you want to read a chat GPT.
Oh, so it's so funny. So I was just about to read this one, but now I'll have to do a different one, which was, if you could invent a gadget to help perfectionists, what would it be, and would it ever be perfect enough for them? That's what but actually
came up with it. Awesome.
Yeah, you and ChatGPT came up with the same question. Well, so, and then the other, I'll read one more just because, these aren't good questions. ChatGPT is not, I asked it.
Not perfect. It's not perfect.
How do you think a perfectionist would react if they received an award for the world's okayest perfectionist? So that's
probably be devastated, right?
Wait, what?
So I'm going to go. It's.
Well, this is the great thing about AI, I guess, is AI is not perfectionist.
Yeah.
Well, AI is the sum total of all the imperfections that are on the internet, right?
It's a great, it's the summation of imperfection. So I've been practicing Tai Chi for about 30 years now, and I do it every day. It's something that I start my day doing, and for the longest time, and Tai Chi, it's like, it looks very simple when you're watching it. Oh, these graceful moves, but it's a lot. There's a lot that goes into having to learn what all these moves are. And there was a long stretch of time where I would be in my practice and I would be judging myself as I was doing the Tai Chi. Oh, you didn't do that right. You didn't do that right. You didn't get that right. And then I would look to that and say, well, this is going to be indicative of how my day is going to go. Because if my Tai Chi didn't go well, then I guess my day isn't going to go well. And lo and behold, what happens? My day isn't going. And I look at it as because I'm looking at my day with that kind of lens. It's not that this is a clairvoyant activity that's going to tell me what's going to happen in the future. But then one of my Tai Chi instructors had a really good quote about Tai Chi, which was, practice doesn't make perfect. It just makes you a little less wrong each time. And I
just finished Atomic Habits, the book Atomic Habits, which is kind of like in that same vein. So we are coming right up quickly on the end of the half hour. As I promised, Brian, it goes by really fast. And we always go around and ask our guest first, as I want you to give one take-home message. And so, Brian, why don't you kick us off with one thought you will leave our audience with?
Just self-kindness. That would be, to me, the one thing.
Yeah, great. Jeff, do you want to go next?
Before I do mine, Brian, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you and connect with you if they're looking to chat with you, work with you, etc.?
Yeah, so company website is Shapiro Communications with an S.com. You can also email Shapiro Communications, one word, again, with the S at the end, at gmail.com. That should suffice.
Awesome. I would say, so for me, I don't know, I'm super obsessed with this idea about this sort of identity of, people's identity and how much it is caught up in their sense of, perfectionism is sort of caught up with like, this is who I am, and how do you sort of rethink that and move away from that. So that's, kind of an obsession of mine right now. So I'll say that's my takeaway, and I will pass it over to Elena.
Thank you. So for me, the biggest aha is that perfectionism is a form of control. And I certainly define myself as a perfectionist, but I do not want to define myself as a control freak whatsoever. So maybe, just maybe, this is my way out, that every time my perfectionist self is trying to be perfect, I would remind myself that it is a form of control, and I need to let go if I don't want to perceive myself as a control freak. So I love that. Thank you.
And so I always seem to end up with two things. So my first thought, my serious was that this concept, Brian, that you brought up of these sort of subtle and maybe not so subtle ways that organizations reinforce, like that we need to be thoughtful about what is it that we're saying by creating, like, for example, you brought up the teacher rating form. You're actually creating this system that is geared towards that. And frankly, the whole internet is set up on these likes, and that was my joke before. Like our whole lives are now centered around these sort of like kind of, BS metrics of like how well we're being perceived. The last thing I want to leave us with is the other thing I learned is I kind of want to just like send a like hot chocolate or whatever to that student you mentioned. I just feel really, really bad for them. I think they need like some warm hugs and some hot chocolate and maybe just to chill on the couch and watch a movie. Anyway, thank you so much, Brian, for an amazing episode. This was really informative, and as always, learned a lot. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me on.